Dark shadows over the mountains. The cold autumn air pierced through the dark forest as Alex and Peter drove along the narrow mountain road. The car struggled uphill, pushing through the thick curtain of fog. The headlights barely managed to cut through the dense darkness. Towering trees swayed under the gusts of wind, their branches resembling twisted fingers, reaching out to grasp the travelers. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Peter muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "We could have just stayed down in the city for the night." "It's safe here," Alex replied, though his voice lacked confidence. "This house belonged to my grandfather. I used to come here as a child. But it's been a long time." "That's exactly what worries me," Peter said grimly. The house stood in a remote part of the mountains, far from civilization. Alex's grandfather, long gone now, had left this wooden cabin as an inheritance. Alex remembered running through its corridors as a child, listening to old tales about ancient curses and strange creatures that roamed the mountains. Back then, he thought they were just stories. But now, as the road led them to the gloomy building, the unease became almost unbearable. They stopped the car in front of the old gate. The wooden planks creaked in the wind, producing a sound that resembled a faint whisper. Peter's gaze swept over the house's facade, somber, silent, as if it were watching them. The windows were dark, some of them veiled in cobwebs. "Welcome home," Alex murmured uncertainly as he opened the car door. At that very moment, the wind howled through the trees, as if warning them. Peter cast a nervous glance at the sky, now covered with thick clouds. "Great! I hope you have firewood for the fireplace, 'cause it looks like it's gonna be a cold night." Alex silently unlocked the old door. As he pushed it open, something in the darkness let out a sigh. It could have been the wind, of course. But then why did a shiver run down Peter's spine? Inside the house, the air smelled of dampness and age. It was heavy, with a faint taste of dust and decayed wood. Alex switched on his flashlight, and its narrow beam illuminated the shrouded furniture. The shadows of their figures danced along the walls, taking on eerie shapes. "Charming place, no doubt about it," Peter remarked sarcastically, picking up an old candlestick from the floor. "Let's not split up, all right?" "No problem," Alex agreed, trying not to reveal his unease. They moved toward the living room, where an aged family portrait stood on the mantelpiece. Alex ran his hand over the dust, revealing his grandfather's face. His eyes seemed too alive, as if watching the visitors from another world. Suddenly, a creak echoed from the hallway. Both men froze, listening. It wasn't just the sound of old wood, someone, or something, was moving in the darkness. "Are you sure that's the wind?" Peter whispered, gripping the candlestick tighter. "I hope so," Alex replied, stepping forward. At that moment, a door at the far end of the corridor slowly creaked open on its own. Behind it lay only darkness. The slowly opening door revealed a dark passageway. Alex cautiously directed his flashlight beam inside, illuminating the dust-covered corridor. The old carpet on the floor was torn, and the peeling wallpaper exposed cracked wooden walls. "I don't like this," Peter whispered, but he followed Alex anyway. Their footsteps echoed through the house, creating the eerie illusion that someone was mirroring their movements. Alex reached the door at the end of the hallway and stopped. His hand brushed against the old bronze doorknob, ice-cold, as if it had just been frozen. "This place gives me the creeps," Peter admitted. "What, afraid of ghosts?" Alex tried to joke, but his voice was strained. He pushed the door open. Inside was a room he remembered from childhood. The old library, filled with books his grandfather had collected over the years. The shelves leaned at odd angles, some books lay scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and aged paper. "This was where my grandfather spent most of his time," Alex murmured. Peter picked up one of the books and carefully flipped through its yellowed pages. But something was off. The lines of text shifted, as if the words were moving on their own. The letters rearranged themselves into new sentences. "Alex, are you seeing this?" Peter's voice trembled. On the page, new words emerged. "You were not supposed to come here." Suddenly, something heavy struck the window. The friends spun around sharply, but there was no one outside. Only their own reflections, distorted by fear. Silence engulfed the library, but it was quickly broken by a new sound. Somewhere above, the wind howled, and suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the second floor. Alex and Peter froze, exchanging anxious glances. "That wasn't the wind," Peter whispered, gripping the book in his hands. "We need to get out of here," Alex replied, but before he could take a step toward the exit, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlight flickered, its beam unsteady, as if the batteries were moments away from dying. In the corner of the room, something shifted, and a shadow darted along the bookshelves. The air inside the library grew thick, pressing down on them like an unseen force. Peter stepped back and tripped over the torn carpet. He fell, the book slipping from his grasp. As it landed, its pages fluttered open, revealing new words, bleeding onto the paper in dark ink. "Too late. You are already here. Alex." Peter whispered as he scrambled to his feet. Alex didn't respond. He stood frozen, staring at the old portrait of his grandfather hanging on the wall. The eyes of the man in the painting had changed. They no longer looked lifeless, they were watching them. Suddenly, the bookshelves trembled, sending books crashing to the floor. The wind inside the room intensified, though all the windows remained tightly shut. Somewhere in the distance, a muffled woman's voice whispered. They were never supposed to return. The door flew open again. The dark corridor awaited. The dark corridor greeted them with an eerie silence. Alex and Peter stepped cautiously, trying not to make a sound. The door behind them closed on its own, but by now, that hardly seemed strange. "We need to find a way out," Peter whispered, glancing at the dark corners. "First, we need to understand what's happening here," Alex replied, scanning the space for any clue. Suddenly, the flashlight's beam caught something on the wall, a familiar sight. An old family portrait. But this time, something was different. The people in the image looked wrong. Their faces were altered, blurred, their eyes darker, hollow. "This isn't normal," Peter whispered, stepping back. There was something else. Another figure had appeared in the painting. A tall, shadowy presence loomed behind the family, though it hadn't been there before. Then, without warning, the floor beneath them trembled. From the far end of the corridor came a low, guttural moan. It sounded as if it was rising from deep underground. "We need to get out of here, now," Peter shouted. But as they turned to run, something was there. A figure. Tall. Dark. Motionless. Its outline flickered, as though it didn't fully belong to this world. It had no face, only two hollow, empty voids where I should have been. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to step back, but his legs refused to move. The shadow reached out, its elongated, twisted hand stretching toward them. "You have returned." The voice was not one, but many. A chorus of whispers, overlapping, rising from the void. The flashlight flickered, then died. Darkness enveloped them, thick and suffocating. Even the faint flicker of Alex's flashlight felt powerless against it. Peter breathed heavily, struggling to keep his fear in check, but his heart pounded so loudly he was certain whatever lurked in the shadows could hear it. "We're not alone here," Alex whispered. "I figured that out a while ago," Peter muttered, keeping his eyes locked on the motionless figure ahead. It didn't move, yet the very air around it seemed to warp and bend. A strange energy radiated from it, sending a tingling sensation across their skin. Then, the silence shattered. A distant voice echoed from somewhere in the corridor. "You are not supposed to be here." The voice was both human and inhuman, carrying an eerie resonance of something ancient, something long forgotten. It sent a cold shiver down their spines. Alex instinctively took a step back, and at that moment, the shadow before them began to move. Slowly. Silently. Gliding toward them, its outline trembling, as if it were made not of flesh, but of pure darkness. Peter grabbed Alex's shoulders. "Run!" They bolted down the corridor, Alex's flashlight flailing wildly, casting frantic shadows along the walls. But no matter how fast they ran, the house seemed to shift around them. Doors they had seen moments ago had vanished, replaced by unfamiliar passageways leading deeper into the abyss. "It's a trap!" Alex shouted. Behind them, heavy footsteps echoed once more. They weren't alone, something was following, unseen yet undeniable. The wind carried a drawn-out, ghostly moan, and suddenly, new words appeared on the walls, scrawled in what looked like blood. "You will not escape." They surged forward, but the darkness was faster. It slithered into every corner, wrapping around them with invisible claws. And then, everything went black. Alex opened his eyes. The darkness around him felt almost tangible, it pressed in on him, suffocating, making his skin crawl with cold dread. He could hear breathing nearby, Peter was still there. But something had changed. The air was thicker now, saturated with a damp scent of earth and aged wood. "Peter?" Alex's voice trembled. "I'm here, but where are we?" his friend whispered. Before them stretched a corridor that hadn't been there before. Its walls were distorted, stretched unnaturally, as if twisted into a grotesque nightmare. There were no doors, only an endless passageway leading deeper into the black void. Behind them came the sound of scraping. Something was moving. Slowly. Relentlessly. They were being followed. "We have to run!" Peter shouted, grabbing Alex's arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted down the corridor, but it seemed infinite. Terror clawed at their chests, and with every step, thousands of whispers echoed from the walls, rising like a chorus of the damned. "It's a trap!" Alex gasped. "We're never getting out." "We have to!" Peter cried desperately, glancing back. And then they saw it. The darkness behind them had taken form. Eyes, endless, empty voids, stared hungrily at them. Hands, impossibly long and skeletal, reached forward. It was here. It had been waiting. Run! Alex screamed, lunging forward. The corridor twisted in madness. The ceiling became the floor, walls melted into one another, shadows broke apart and reformed. This place was alive. And then, light. A faint glow shimmered ahead, struggling through the cracks in the wooden planks. They sprinted toward it, desperate, reckless. But the darkness was not about to let them go so easily. The light ahead grew brighter, but with every step, they felt the darkness behind them closing in. Something unseen reached for their backs, cold, insatiable. Peter was the first to break through, squeezing through the narrow gap between the shattered wooden planks. Alex was right behind him, but just as he lunged for the opening, an invisible force clamped around his ankle. "No!" Peter shouted, stretching out his hand. Alex felt himself being pulled back into the void, cold fingers coiling around his leg like iron chains. He clawed at the ground, struggling, fighting with everything he had. "He cannot leave!" The voice thundered from the darkness, vibrating through the very air, ancient and unyielding. Peter, summoning every ounce of strength, seized Alex's arm and yanked him forward. For a moment, everything froze. The darkness hesitated. And then, suddenly, it let go. They tumbled out onto the damp earth, gasping for breath. Above them, the sky was heavy with clouds, but stars had begun to pierce through. They lay there, panting, barely believing they had escaped. The house loomed in front of them, old, silent, but no longer as menacing. The darkness within had retreated, as if conceding defeat. "We need to go, now," Alex rasped. They scrambled to their feet, not daring to look back, and rushed toward the car. Peter fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, then revved the engine. Tires spun against gravel as they sped down the winding mountain road. Silence filled the car, heavy and suffocating. Peter finally spoke. "What was that?" Alex didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. And then he froze. On the house's doorstep, a figure stood motionless, watching them. And then it smiled.